In modern psychology, the phenomenon of the Electra Complex is often hidden behind the deceptively sweet term, daddy's girl. When we hear those words, we usually imagine a little princess in a pink dress, being coddled and spoiled. But in the real world, the face of a daddy's girl looks very different. These are often outwardly successful, independent, and highly respected women, the leaders, the achievers, the women who seem to have it all. But behind closed doors, they have never truly known love, only approval. They suffer from a crushing sense of inadequacy, a feeling that no matter how much they achieve, it will never be enough. You won't find direct statistics stating that 20% of women suffer from the Electra complex, because it is not a clinical disease, but a developmental stage in which many become stuck. However, because its symptoms are so subtle and deeply woven into our behavior, it is far more prevalent than it might seem. The most terrifying thing about this complex is that you can live your entire life within it, reaching the highest peaks of social success and never once suspect the true cause of your unhappiness. You think you are ambitious, but you are actually just indebted. I know this because for 30 years I was that woman. And if you're listening to this, chances are high that it might be you too. Remember the movie The Princess and the Frog? The main character, Tiana, works herself to the bone to fulfill a single dream, opening a restaurant. But here's the thing, it wasn't originally her dream, it was her father's. From the very start, we see her sacrificing her youth, her social life, and her joy to honor the ghost of a man who is no longer there. This isn't just a surface-level cartoon, it's a vivid depiction of a psychological phenomenon Carl Jung called the Electra Complex. I know the story well because it was mine for over 30 years. When I was 3 years old, my father, a gifted musician, walked away from his career to build a business. He did it so that, in his words, I could have everything. And I did. He built a business that met every material need. But that success came with a price. I was sent to live with my grandparents. By the time I was 7, my parents decided I was better off there, since they were both so busy making money for my better future. Naturally, the 7-year-old girl felt abandoned. It was unconscious then, but looking back, it is a textbook example of how an abandonment wound forms. Children react to this in different ways. My response was to decide that this is a tough world. I forbade myself from complaining or crying ever again. Instead, I decided I simply had to try harder to earn my right to exist in this world. You see, there is a dark side to a father's love that we rarely talk about. In the Electra complex, even a devoted father can become a devouring parent. When my father told me he gave up his music for my future, he was unconsciously handing me an invisible contract. It was a bill I never signed, yet I felt obligated to pay it with my entire life. His sacrifice became my debt. When a parent sacrifices their joy for their child, they often accidentally create a prison of guilt for that child. You feel that if you don't succeed, his sacrifice was in vain. You aren't living for yourself anymore, you are living to justify his pain. Needless to say that, driven by this invisible weight, I was a straight-A student throughout school, but that was never enough. At first, I followed in my father's footsteps and finished music school, but I was a mediocre musician at best, so I channeled my energy into writing, something I actually had a true talent for. At 12, I wrote my first story. At 15, my first detective novel. The only person whose opinion mattered was my father. My parents had supported my initial effort, even self-publishing my first story. But when I brought my first novel to my father, hoping for a spark of connection, he crushed it with criticism. because I felt deeply indebted for the sacrifice he made, giving up his music to provide for me, I simply shut down. That day I closed my notebook and didn't open it again for 20 years. Instead, I started studying him. I wanted to know what made him happy. It seemed to be politics. He once told me he'd been offered a chance to run for parliament, adding, "I'm sure I would have been a great politician, but if I had run for parliament, you wouldn't have had a father." Politics was literally life-threatening in Ukraine in the 90s, but he also meant it would have consumed his every waking hour. While those words became my invisible prison, I felt a crushing sense of debt. If he had sacrificed his political ambitions for my safety and wealth, I owed it to him to become the politician he couldn't be. To cut a long story short, by the age of 32, I had built a career in the socio-political sector with a manic intensity. I was a very serious person. I controlled every movement, every photo, every smile. I wasn't a living woman. I was a living monument to his unfulfilled potential. But living as a monument has a price. For decades, I rejected the feminine. While I spent hours every day talking to my father, discussing strategy and professional goals, my relationship with my mother was a desert. I can hardly remember us ever doing girly stuff. No shopping, no gossip. To me, being feminine felt like a weakness. I felt that if I identified with my mother, I would lose my father's respect. The price extended to my personal life as well. I also faced a glass wall in love. I never married. Once I was engaged, but I literally ran away because the partnership felt suffocating. Instead, I found myself in a loop of being the other woman, falling for married men or narcissists who were physically present but emotionally unavailable. It was painful and it always ended quickly, leaving me to get back on track with my mission for my father. But the ultimate price was that my body was in lockdown. Physically, I was a fortress. Sexuality felt painful and awkward. I didn't know my own body and I had never experienced an orgasm with a man. I was fighting for the freedom of my country while my own body was living in a state of total lockdown. I was always tired, exhausted, and angry. By my 20s, I already had a deep wrinkle between my eyebrows, now almost gone, and I never let myself rest except for 2 weeks of annual Ayurvedic treatment in India. It was so efficient, it would literally rejuvenate me for 6 months, just enough fuel to return to self-sacrificing mode to repay my debt to my father. The climax came in 2019. I stood for parliamentary elections in Ukraine that year. I felt just like Tiana from The Princess and the Frog when she was so close to finally buying that old sugar mill for the restaurant her father had dreamed of. The one she had saved for penny by penny, working 2 jobs without a moment's rest. I was officially a candidate number 3 on the party list, and I remember the rush of holding that official registration ID. I was inches away from fulfilling the dream I had stolen from my father and made my own. But I didn't make it. And then, suddenly, everything started to fall apart. Shortly after, I found myself in a chair across from a therapist, sobbing because I felt like a total failure. I was about to turn 33, I had no relationship, no family, no possessions, and I had just failed at the one thing I had sacrificed everything else for. I felt like a complete loser. Little did I know that failure marked the beginning of my awakening, a journey that would take the next 7 years. And it began with the discovery that everything I was experiencing was a symptom of what Carl Jung called the Electra Complex. In my second year of therapy, I discovered that the invisible script I had been following for 20 years had a name. In 1913, Carl Jung called it the Electra Complex. This is a much more common issue than you might think. You'll see it for yourself once we place it in the context of human development, a process every single one of us undergoes. To understand this, we need to remember that Jung began as Sigmund Freud's star student. They eventually fell out because Jung's brilliant mind delved deeper into the depths of the human psyche, identifying what Freud has overlooked. The Electra Complex is a perfect example of where Jung took Freud's foundations and expanded them to include the female experience. So, according to Freud, every child goes through 5 specific phases of psychosexual development from birth to the age 18. These are natural processes. However, if any of these phases isn't completed, if the flow is interrupted, the psyche gets stuck. Physically and socially you grow up. You get a degree, a job, a car, but emotionally a part of you remains frozen in that childhood moment, desperately trying to complete an unfinished cycle. In your adult life, this manifests as a compulsion to repeat the same childhood patterns, unconsciously hoping this time for a different ending. Freud originally described this happening to boys between the ages of 3 and 6, the so-called phallic stage. During this time, a boy subconsciously falls in love with his mother. He wants to take his father's place. He might even tell his mom he's going to marry her when he grows up. Naturally, the father becomes a rival. The boy feels competition, hostility, or coldness toward him. Normally, by age 7, the boy realizes he cannot win his mother, so the psyche decides to become like the father. He identifies with him, copies his values, and essentially says, I will grow up to be a man like my father, so I can find a woman like my mother. But what if the process is broken? For instance, if the mother is emotionally absent or physically gone, the boy's psyche gets trapped in that competition. He becomes a man who is forever unconsciously fighting his father for the ghost of his mother. Freud called this an Oedipus complex, named after the Greek myth of the king who killed his father and married his mother. While pop culture often depicts this as mommy's boy, it can manifest in many forms. For instance, a man who only chases cold, unavailable women, or Don Juans who switch partners constantly because they are incapable of building true depth. However, Freud had a blind spot. He viewed women's development merely as a secondary version of men's. Jung corrected this. He realized that girls go through the exact same process, just in a mirror image. Just as a boy projects his internal image of the feminine onto his mother, a girl projects her internal image of the masculine, her animus, onto her father. If her development at this stage is interrupted, her psyche gets stuck. That's essentially the formation of complex. Jung named it after the Greek myth of Electra, who was so devoted to her father, King Agamemnon, that she helped her brother kill their mother to avenge his death. In essence, the Electra complex is the female mirror of the Oedipus complex. It is much less known, but the mechanics are the same. If that connection with the father is traumatized, a woman's psychological life can freeze for decades. You become a living monument to a man trapped in a stage that prevents you from ever truly becoming yourself. In my case, the interruption was a trauma of rejection. When I was 3, my father left his music career to disappear into business. By the time I was 7, I was sent to live with my grandparents. To my child brain, that felt like being abandoned. When a child feels rejected by the parents they adore, they don't stop loving them. They start performing for them. They freeze in that stage, forever trying to be enough to make the parents stay. If you are wondering if you might have been living in this shadow, look for these markers. First is mission as an offering. You aren't living your own life, you are executing your father's will. My career in politics wasn't my dream. It was a way to pay back a debt for his sacrifice. Second is the guilt of existence, a deep-seated feeling that because your father gave up everything for you, you owe him total devotion. This leads to hyper-responsibility and chronic workaholism. Third is the armor of a serious woman. To stay daddy's girl, you reject the feminine mother. You avoid girly stuff, you hate being vulnerable, and you maintain a rigid, controlled image. You become a warrior to earn his respect, but you lose your softness. Next is sexual dissociation. When you are unconsciously married to your father's approval, real intimacy with other men feels like a betrayal. Sex becomes painful, mechanical, or completely blocked. The core of the Electra Complex is a devastating illusion, the belief that love must be earned through achievements. I unconsciously believed that if I reached Parliament, I would finally be worthy. I thought if I carried that crystal vase of his dreams to the finish line, I would finally be free. In that sense, the crash of 2019 was an existential gift. Falling apart allowed the daddy's girl in me to die so the woman could be born. I realized that destroying my father's restaurant was the only way to hear the quiet voice of the 15-year-old girl who just wanted to write. However, healing is difficult and painful. It means ruining the entire life you built around someone else's identity. Suddenly, you feel as if you've been living someone else's life, and everything, work, relationships, aspirations, loses its meaning. You find yourself in a limbo, required to rediscover who you are and rebuild your life from scratch. Healing is individual, but there are key elements this process must include. And that's what we'll discuss next. In psychology, we talk about resolving a complex. It sounds clinical, almost tidy. In reality, it is a process of breaking yourself down to the core. To heal from a lifelong script is not a gentle self-care ritual. It is a total demolition. You have to dismantle an entire life that was carefully built around someone else's identity. From a clinical perspective, this transformation requires three fundamental shifts. First is the de-idealization of the father. This is the cornerstone. Healing begins when the father stops being a grand deity, the sole source of truth and safety, and becomes a human being. You see his weaknesses, his traumas, and his errors. Only then can your psyche stop trying to save him or fulfill his abandoned dreams. You realize your life is not a debt payment for his sacrifices. Second is the reconciliation with the mother. You cannot heal the Electra Complex without revisiting the feminine within. This means ending the unconscious competition for the father's gaze and accepting the mother as woman with her own power. This allows you to embrace your own softness and sexuality, which were previously rejected as weakness. Third is the dissolution of the body armor. Scientifically, this is the shift from a phallic stage to a genital one, the removal of a psychosomatic shell. The dissociation between the head and the body disappears. You gain the ability to experience pleasure and intimacy without a subconscious sense of guilt toward the inner father. In Jungian terms, this is the return of the projection. The qualities you once saw only in men, logic, decisiveness, social power, you finally discover within yourself. The animus stops being an external tyrant you must please and becomes an internal ally who helps you create. The ultimate goal is the conjunctio, the sacred marriage within the psyche where your masculine and feminine energies become co-authors of your life. For me, these weren't just abstract concepts. They were written in blood, sweat, and the brutal reality of a country at war. It was as if my internal processes collided head-on with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. When it happened in 2022, I went into a hero mode, the classic warrior animus. I traveled the globe advocating for my country at the UN Security Council, the OSCE, and the Council of Europe. I spoke to parliaments and governments on almost every continent. I was fueled by that same hyper-responsibility I had learned as a child. That year, the organization I worked with was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for its efforts. I was a Nobel laureate's representative, performing at the peak of my powers. Yet inside, I was still that 7-year-old girl trying to justify her right to exist. And I would have kept going, but the universe had other plans. A tumor grew in my body, stopping me in my tracks. It was the physical manifestation of a system that could no longer run on duty. Forced back to Kiev, I had to choose, keep performing or survive. And then, in the middle of the war, I did the unthinkable. I just walked away from everything, from the career I had spent a decade building, from everything that was valuable. I turned down lucrative contracts and entered a 3-year hermit mode, cutting off almost every connection I had. It wasn't a rational decision. In fact, it was irrational in every sense. But I felt like it was now or never. If I didn't return to that 15-year-old girl who wanted to write, I would never truly live. Next year, I spent in a writing school. I remember the feeling of seeing my first short stories published. It felt more real than any political victory I ever had. I dived into mysticism, science, and philosophy. I launched a YouTube channel to share my discoveries. During this time, I wrote 2 books. One called 11 Stages of Awakening, and the second one is The Knowledge of Oneness, the case for unity of science, religion, and philosophy. The latter was the literal tool of my salvation. I remember writing in my diary, when I finish this book, I will reach self-awareness. In Jungian terms, it was a process of healing through the logos. As I structured the unity of the universe on the page, I was structuring my own shattered psyche. I was literally writing my way out of the complex. But the psyche doesn't let go easily. As we discussed in the last episode about the twin flames, the psyche often demands a final sacrifice of the ego. Just as I was working on the book, the final exam appeared. A relationship with a spiritual narcissist. If you've listened to my previous episodes, you know that we have been on a journey. In the first episode of the series on relationships, we explored the 4 stages of animus projection, how we project our inner masculine onto the people. In the second episode, we talked about the twin flames and spiritual narcissist, who often appear as a personification of that 3rd stage of projection. Here is the secret. Spiritual narcissists are magnetically attracted to Electras. Why? Because we have an open vacancy for grandiose God. We are professionally trained from childhood to serve greatness, to ignore our own needs, and to keep a monument standing. He didn't just happen to me. He was my final exam. He was the shadow of my father, returning one last time to ask, are you finally ready to choose yourself over the guru? He was a perfect mirror of my father, grandiose, brilliant, and demanding. It was a test. Would I serve his greatness or trust my own? The book had become my spine. I didn't need a guru or father figure anymore. I had found the conjuncture, the inner marriage, within myself. So I walked away. I finally bridged the desert between me and my mother. By stopping the competition for my father's ghost, I could see her as a woman, and in doing so, I could finally see myself as one. I also dismantled the physical fortress. Through literature and self-discovery, I went from being a frozen monument to a woman who finally understood her own pleasure. Ironically, the intensity of that final toxic relationship helped. It cracked the ice and forced all that suppressed energy to finally surface. But the final liberation did not happen on paper or in my mind. It happened in the physical world, and it was far more dramatic. Healing is often painted as a peaceful process, but for me it was a battle. As I began to prioritize my own interests, psychology, mysticism, my writing, the rift between my father and me grew. Every time I visited, he would dismiss my life with biting comments. It's all nonsense, it's a cult, you're just wasting your potential. For a long time I stayed silent. I would just walk away. The good girl, still trying to keep the peace. But one day the monument finally cracked. I exploded. I looked at him and told him the truth, that I would no longer be suppressed, that I had a right to my own values, my own interests, and my own respect. The reaction was terrifying. This man, whom I had spent 30 years trying to please, did not respond with words. He advanced on me with his whole body, his face full of rage I had never seen, looking as if he was ready to strike me down. In that moment something shifted. I didn't shrink. I looked him dead in the eyes and said, "You want to hit me? Go ahead. Hit me because I'm not obeying you anymore." The air was thick with violence. If my mother and sister hadn't literally held him back, I don't know what would have happened. But in that terrifying moment of looking him in the eye, the spell was broken. The daddy's girl finally died in that room, and the woman stood up in her place. I realized that the price of his protection was my authentic self, and I was no longer willing to pay it. I walked out the next morning, leaving that house for good. We haven't spoken since. Walking away wasn't just leaving a house, it was leaving a 30-year-old prison. This was my true de-idealization of the father. I stopped unconsciously looking for his approval and started looking for the truth. I was finally, for the first time, truly alone and truly free. It doesn't mean that I stopped loving my family. We don't stop loving others just because they are unable to love us back in a healthy way. But if choosing myself means walking away, so be it. Healing does not always mean reconciliation. Integrating the inner masculine, the animus, is an internal process. It may involve, but certainly does not require, a peace treaty with the person who once carried that projection. This is why this work can be done even if the father is no longer alive or is out of reach. The work is between you and yourself, not you and him. It wasn't a happy ending in the traditional sense. Your story doesn't have to end like mine. But this is what it actually takes for the daughter to die so that woman can be born. It is the violent shift from being an object of someone else's expectations to being the subject of your own life. Psychoanalysis says the Electra Complex is resolved when your partner is no longer a father figure, your creativity is your own, and your identity feels self-sufficient. But as you've heard, the road to that resolution is written in blood and sweat. My path took 7 years. It went through a war, a tumor, and bankruptcy. I was in hermit mode, not because I just decided to change a hobby, but because true liberation required tearing myself out of a toxic environment by the roots. The maturation happened gradually, over many years, and the release wasn't just internal through my writing, but external through physical confrontation and a total break. I had to dismantle my entire life, go back to that 15-year-old girl with a notebook, and start everything from scratch. But I did it. It is possible, and for the first time, I am the one holding the pen. Think back to Tiana from The Princess and the Frog we started the story with. To find herself, she had to lose everything she thought was important. She lost the chance to fulfill her father's dream, and she even lost her human form. She had to be stripped down to nothing, transformed into a frog, to finally see the truth. Through that total destruction of her old identity, and through her journey with Naveen, who acted as a mirror for her own animus, She reached a moment of clarity. Only when the old Tiana died could she finally say, I finally know what I want. Like her, many of us have to face our own metamorphosis. We have to stop being the daughters of our father's dreams to become the subjects of our own lives. It is a violent, painful awakening, but it is the only way to finally, truly come home to yourself. If you're listening to this and wondering, is this me? Here is what you need to know. There is no medical census for the Electra Complex because it isn't a disease. It's a developmental stage where millions of women get stuck. Why is there so little official data? Because Electras are the most convenient members of the society. They don't break laws, they work harder than anyone else, they pay their taxes and strive for perfection. Psychiatry doesn't notice them until the body gives up, until the tumor appears or the bank accounts are frozen. Plus, in our culture, being a daddy's girl who builds a massive career just to make him proud is seen as a strong character, not a psychological prison. But the indirect data reveals the true scale of this hidden epidemic. Research in organizational psychology, including the landmark study by Hennig and Jardim, shows that up to 80% of female executives in high-level positions were firstborn or only daughters with a dominant father figure. These successful women confirmed that it was their father's approval that was the main driver of their early achievements. It's that mask of success where outward success is often a lifelong attempt to buy a father's love through achievement. The Electra Complex flourishes not only under overprotection but also through a father's emotional unavailability. According to data from National Fatherhood Initiative, daughters who have complex or cold relationships with their fathers are 2 or 3 times more likely to enter destructive relationships with men, often narcissists, later in life. This statistically confirms the phenomenon of the vacancy for a grandiose god. Psychologists from Yale and other universities have studied what is known as adaptive versus destructive perfectionism. Many women living with good girl syndrome, the social facade of the Electra Complex, show extremely high cortisol levels and an elevated risk of burnout. This confirms that behind closed doors, these women suffer profoundly, regardless of their social status. If you recognize yourself in these numbers, know this: what you are experiencing is not success. You are simply performing for approval. The key is to see things for what they are, and once you see the truth, have the courage to believe it and the strength to act upon it. Because as long as you are performing for someone else, you don't truly own your life, and you don't truly own your results. The Electra Complex has lingering shadows that achievement cannot hide. In my case, it was financial sabotage. Because I couldn't trust the original man in my life, I subconsciously didn't trust money. I earned it and then I purged it. At one point, I ended up in total bankruptcy with blocked accounts and actual hunger. I mean, literally, I was starving for days because I had no money to buy myself even an apple. I had to learn to build trust in myself and resources from scratch, without my father's business logic. True liberation isn't complete until you own your resources as much as you own your story, because the hand that holds the pen must also be the hand that claims the harvest. We're going to talk about why, for a modern Electra, money is often the final battlefield for her independence in the next episode. See you in the next one.